They thought Bobo the Clown was just an entertainer. What historians discovered proved otherwise. The National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., receives photographs documenting black life across American history almost daily. Some images show celebrations, achievements, and family moments. Others document the painful realities of racism, violence, and exploitation. But on a muggy afternoon in July 2024, archivist Dr. Marcus Reynolds opens a package that will uncover one of the most disturbing cases of child trafficking and racial violence hidden in plain sight for over a century. The donation comes from a descendant of a family in Birmingham, Alabama. The letter explains that the sender, Rebecca Hartley, is white and recently discovered photographs and documents while cleaning out her deceased grandmother's attic. The materials belonged to her great-great-grandfather, and some of the content disturbed her enough to believe they should be examined by historians who could provide context. Marcus carefully removes several photographs from protective sleeves. Most show typical scenes from the early 1900s, family gatherings, businesses, street scenes. But one photograph makes him stop and stare. The image is a professional studio portrait, sepia-toned and remarkably well-preserved, dated on the back as 1908. The photographer's mark reads, Sterling Studio, Birmingham, Alabama. At the center of the composition sits a figure in a clown costume. White face paint with exaggerated features, curly wig, a wide painted grin that looks more unsettling than cheerful, wearing a dark vest with a prominent ruffled collar over a buttoned suit. The makeup is elaborate, professional, clearly the work of someone who performed regularly. But it's the two young black boys flanking the clown that make Marcus's stomach tighten. They stand rigidly on either side, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, wearing identical formal attire. White collared shirts, dark suspenders, dark pants. Their expressions are solemn, almost fearful, their eyes wide and watchful in a way that suggests they're not comfortable, not safe. The composition is perfectly symmetrical, the boys positioned like props, like possessions displayed alongside the central figure. There's something deeply wrong about the image. Something that goes beyond the inherent creepiness of early clown photography. Marcus pulls out his magnifying glass and examines the photograph more closely. The clown's hand rests on the shoulder of the boy on the left, not gently, but with fingers that appear to be gripping tightly. The boy on the right stands with his hands clenched at his sides, knuckles visible even through the photograph's grain. Marcus turns the photograph over. Written on the back in faded ink, Bobo the Clown with performers. Birmingham, May 1908. And below that, in different handwriting, much more recent, Grandmother said these boys went missing. Nobody ever found them. She said there were others too. God forgive what great-grandfather knew and didn't stop. Marcus reads the inscription 3 times. Missing boys, others too. Someone in the Hartley family knew that children associated with this clown had disappeared, and they'd kept silent about it for over a century. He examines the other photographs in the donation. Several show the same clown in different settings, performing at what appears to be a carnival, standing with groups of white children at birthday parties, posed with various young black boys in different studio settings. In every photograph with black children, the boys look frightened or subdued. In photographs with white children, the clown appears jovial, and the children seem happy. Marcus photographs everything at high resolution and begins researching. He needs to find out who Bobo the Clown was, what happened to those boys, and what the Hartley family knew about it. He searches Birmingham newspapers from 1908 and finds advertisements for Bobo the Clown, described as a popular children's entertainer who performed at parties, carnivals, and civic events. The advertisements list the proprietor as Walter J. Hartley, Entertainment Services. Marcus's pulse quickens. Hartley, the same surname as the woman who donated the photographs. He searches for Walter J. Hartley and finds him listed in the 1910 census as a 42-year-old white man, occupation entertainer and impresario, living in Birmingham with his wife and 2 children. But when Marcus searches for missing children reports from Birmingham in the 1900s and 1910s, he finds something that makes his blood run cold. Between 1905 and 1915, at least 23 black boys between the ages of 6 and 12 were reported missing in Birmingham and surrounding areas. The cases received minimal investigation and were never solved. Marcus contacts Dr. Helen Washington, a historian at the University of Alabama at Birmingham, who specializes in racial violence and the exploitation of black children in the Jim Crow South. Helen has spent years documenting cases that were deliberately ignored or covered up by white authorities. Helen calls him back within an hour. 23 missing black boys in a decade. And I've never heard about this. Send me everything you have. If there's a connection to this entertainer, we need to investigate thoroughly. Marcus emails her the photographs and documentation, and they arrange to meet at the Birmingham Public Library archives, where Helen has already requested newspapers, police records, and any available documentation about missing children cases from that period. That evening, Marcus can't stop thinking about the photograph. He zooms in on the boys' faces, studying their expressions. These children are terrified. They're posing for a photograph with someone they fear, standing rigid because they've been told to, trapped in a situation they can't escape. And Bobo the clown. Marcus examines the figure's face beneath the makeup. Even through the white paint and exaggerated features, there's something predatory in the eyes, something cold and calculating that the theatrical costume can't quite disguise. Marcus meets Helen at the Birmingham Public Library archives 2 days later. The librarian has pulled boxes of materials, newspapers, police blotters, court records, and files from various civic organizations that operated in Birmingham during the early 1900s. They divide the work. Helen takes the police records and missing persons reports, while Marcus examines newspapers and court documents. Within the first hour, Helen finds a pattern. The missing boys were all from poor black families, often children of sharecroppers or domestic workers. The reports were filed by desperate parents, but the investigations were perfunctory at best. Police notes include phrases like, "probably ran away," "likely fell into the river," "Negro children frequently leave home," all indicating that authorities put no real effort into finding the boys. Marcus finds something more disturbing in newspapers. Several articles from 1908 mention Bobo the clown performing at prominent white families' parties and civic celebrations. But buried in the back pages of black newspapers, like the Birmingham Reporter, he finds brief notices that tell a different story. From the Birmingham Reporter, June 1908. The parents of Samuel Johnson, age 8, report their son missing since last week. The boy was last seen near the fairgrounds, where a traveling entertainment show was performing. Police have declined to investigate, stating the boy likely wandered off. The family seeks any information about Samuel's whereabouts. From the Birmingham Reporter, September 1908. Another Negro child has gone missing in the Ensley district. Thomas Williams, age 7, disappeared 3 days ago. His mother states he was excited about seeing the clown show that was performing nearby. This marks the third colored child to vanish this year in circumstances involving entertainment shows. Parents in the Negro community are increasingly fearful, but authorities show no interest in investigating. Marcus and Helen exchange grim looks. Black newspapers were noticing the pattern, children disappearing in connection with entertainment shows. But white authorities weren't investigating because the victims were black. They search for more information about Walter Hartley's entertainment business and find that he operated several ventures. He owned Bobo the Clown Performance Services. He managed traveling shows that visited communities throughout Alabama. And troublingly, he operated what was described as a training academy for young performers. Helen finds a business license application from 1906 where Hartley describes his training academy. We recruit talented young colored boys to train as performers, acrobats, and assistants for our traveling shows. These boys are provided room, board, and education in exchange for their services. This charitable work removes vagrant children from the streets and teaches them useful skills. A training academy, Helen says, her voice tight with anger. He was claiming to help black children while actually using them as unpaid labor. Or worse. Marcus finds advertisements for Hartley's shows that feature amazing young colored performers and trained acrobatic boys. The advertisements promise that audiences will be astonished by the skills of these young performers, but there are no names listed, no photographs of the boys' faces, nothing that would help identify them as individuals. They search for anyone who might have survived Hartley's training academy and testified about their experiences. For hours, they find nothing, until Helen discovers a deposition given in 1923, 10 years after Hartley's death, by a man named Isaiah Freeman, who was suing Hartley's estate for damages. Isaiah Freeman's testimony is devastating. My name is Isaiah Freeman. I am 28 years old. When I was 9 years old, in 1904, I was taken by Mr. Walter Hartley, who operated as Bobo the Clown. He came to my family's home in Bessemer and told my parents he ran a school for colored boys where I could learn to perform and earn money. My parents were sharecroppers who could barely feed us, so they agreed to let me go. Mr. Hartley took me and 5 other boys to a building in Birmingham that he called his academy. But it was not a school. It was a prison. We were locked in a room in the basement when we weren't performing or training. We were given minimal food, often just cornmeal and water. We were beaten if we cried or complained. Mr. Hartley, Bobo, would dress in his clown costume and take us to perform at white people's parties and shows. We were made to do acrobatics, to act in skits, to entertain. If we made mistakes, we were punished severely. But the performances were not the worst of it. Mr. Hartley sometimes took individual boys away for what he called special performances. Some boys came back traumatized and silent. Some boys never came back at all. I remember a boy named Samuel, who was brought to the academy in 1908. He was about 8 years old, small and scared. Mr. Hartley had a photograph taken of Samuel and another boy with him in his clown costume. A few weeks later, Samuel vanished. Mr. Hartley told us Samuel had been sent to work for another entertainer, but we never saw him again. Over the 5 years I was held by Mr. Hartley, I saw at least 15 boys disappear. Some, like Samuel, were there briefly and then gone. Others were with us for months or years before vanishing. We never knew what happened to them, but we feared the worst. I only escaped in 1909 when the building caught fire. In the chaos, I ran and kept running until I reached my aunt's home in Atlanta. I was too terrified to tell anyone the full truth of what happened. Mr. Hartley was powerful, and I was just a Negro boy whose testimony wouldn't be believed against a white man. But now, Mr. Hartley is dead, and I want the truth known. He kidnapped colored boys under the pretense of education. He forced us to work without pay. He abused us and allowed others to abuse us. And many boys died or were killed, their bodies disposed of, so no one would know what happened. I am suing for the years of my childhood that were stolen, for the wages I was never paid, and for the trauma I still carry. But more importantly, I want the families of the boys who never came home to know what happened to their children. They deserve the truth, even if it comes years too late. Marcus and Helen sit in stunned silence after reading Isaiah's testimony. The lawsuit was dismissed. The court ruled that Isaiah had no standing to sue the estate because he couldn't prove he hadn't agreed to the arrangement as a child, and his testimony about other missing boys was deemed unsubstantiated since no bodies were ever found. 15 boys that Isaiah personally witnessed disappearing, Marcus says quietly, and the total number of missing boys reported in newspapers was 23. Walter Hartley, performing as Bobo the Clown, was abducting and likely murdering black children for years, and nobody stopped him. They search for what happened to Walter Hartley and find that he died in 1913 at age 45. The obituary in the Birmingham News describes him as a beloved entertainer who brought joy to countless children, and a philanthropist who provided opportunities for underprivileged colored youth. There's no mention of missing children, no hint of the horrors Isaiah described. Hartley died with his reputation intact, protected by the racism that made black children's lives disposable and black families' grief invisible to white authorities. Helen finds one more document that brings the horror into sharp focus. In 1915, 2 years after Hartley's death, construction workers excavating land where Hartley's academy had stood discovered human remains, small bones, clearly children, buried in shallow graves in the basement. The police investigated briefly and issued a report stating the remains were of unknown origin, possibly from the Civil War era, and took no further action. But a black newspaper, the Birmingham World, obtained details from one of the construction workers, a black man who told a reporter that the bones were clearly not old, that they showed signs of violence, and that there were at least 8 sets of remains. The article was published once, then the story disappeared. White newspapers never covered it. No investigation was pursued. The remains were supposedly interred in a potter's field, with no markers, no names, no acknowledgement of who these children were, or what had been done to them. Marcus and Helen need to find descendants of the missing boys and Isaiah Freeman to tell this story properly. They work with genealogists and community historians in Birmingham's black community, reaching out to churches and historical societies. They find descendants of 3 families whose boys went missing in connection with Bobo the Clown, Samuel Johnson's great-niece, Thomas Williams' great-great-nephew, and the grandson of another missing boy named David Carter. Each family had kept the story alive through oral history, passing down the pain of children who vanished and were never found. They also locate Isaiah Freeman's family. Isaiah had moved to Chicago after his testimony was dismissed, married, and had children. His grandson, Dr. Robert Freeman, is a psychologist in Chicago who has spent years researching his grandfather's experiences. Marcus calls Dr. Freeman, his voice shaking slightly. Dr. Freeman, my name is Dr. Marcus Reynolds from the Smithsonian. I've been researching your grandfather Isaiah Freeman's testimony about Walter Hartley, and I've discovered photographs and evidence documenting what your grandfather described: the abduction, abuse, and murder of black children by a man performing as Bobo the Clown. Robert Freeman's response is immediate and emotional. My grandfather carried that trauma his whole life. He testified in 1923, but nobody believed him. Nobody cared. He told us stories about the boys who disappeared, about the horror of being held prisoner by a man dressed as a clown, who everyone else thought was entertaining. We have his written account that he gave to our family before he died, but we never had evidence that anyone else would take seriously. I have that evidence now, Marcus says. I have photographs of your grandfather with Hartley. I have newspaper reports about missing boys. I have records of remains found at Hartley's property. And I want to create an exhibition that tells the truth about what happened, that honors your grandfather's courage in testifying, and acknowledges the children who never came home. Dr. Robert Freeman and descendants of the missing children all travel to Washington over the following weeks. Marcus and Helen spend months working with them, gathering family histories, documenting the impact of these disappearances on families and communities, creating a complete picture of how Walter Hartley used his position as a children's entertainer to abduct and abuse black boys, while white society looked the other way. The family documents Robert Freeman brings include Isaiah's own written account, more detailed than his 1923 testimony. Bobo the clown was a monster wearing a smile. He used that costume, that painted face, to lure children and to hide who he really was. Parents saw a clown and thought their children would be entertained. White audiences saw performances and thought they were watching talented colored boys willingly showing their skills. But we were prisoners. We were beaten, starved, worked until we collapsed. Some boys were sold to other men who wanted children for reasons I cannot write about, without feeling sick. Some boys were killed when they tried to escape, or when they became too difficult to control, or when Hartley simply tired of them. I survived because I was lucky, because I escaped during a fire, because my aunt believed me and hid me until I was old enough to leave Alabama entirely. But I never forgot the boys who didn't survive. I carry their names in my memory: Samuel Johnson, Thomas Williams, David Carter, James Monroe, Henry Jackson, and so many others whose names I never learned, because they were with us so briefly before they vanished. I testified in 1923 because I wanted justice for those boys. When justice was denied, I understood that our lives, black children's lives, didn't matter to the legal system. But I wrote this account so my children and grandchildren would know the truth, so that someday, maybe, someone would care enough to investigate, to acknowledge what happened, to give those boys the recognition they never received. 10 months after Marcus first opened that package, the National Museum of African American History and Culture opens the exhibition Behind the Makeup, the true story of Bobo the Clown and the missing boys of Birmingham. The exhibition occupies a somber gallery designed to honor the victims while unflinchingly presenting the truth. The centerpiece is the 1908 photograph, Bobo the Clown, with the 2 terrified boys. A magnified detail draws attention to the boys' expressions, to the clown's grip on one child's shoulder, to all the signs of fear that white audiences never noticed or cared about. Beside the photograph are the names of 23 boys who went missing in Birmingham between 1905 and 1915, listed with their ages and the dates they disappeared. For many, no other information exists, their lives reduced to a name, an age, and the pain of families who never knew what happened to them. The exhibition tells the complete story through documents, testimony, and historical context. It explains how Walter Hartley used his position as an entertainer to access black communities, how he exploited poverty to persuade parents to give him their children, how he used the training academy as a cover for imprisonment and abuse. One section focuses on Isaiah Freeman's testimony and written account, showing his courage in speaking truth, even when no one would listen, documenting his survival and his determination to preserve the memory of children who didn't survive. Another section examines the systematic failure of authorities to investigate when black children disappeared, showing how racism made these children's lives and safety invisible to white law enforcement. Newspaper articles from white and black papers are displayed side by side. White papers promoting Bobo the Clown's performances, while black papers desperately reported missing children. The exhibition includes documentation of the human remains found in 1915 and the authorities' refusal to investigate properly. A memorial section lists the names of the boys Isaiah remembered: Samuel Johnson, Thomas Williams, David Carter, James Monroe, Henry Jackson, acknowledging them as victims of a crime that was never prosecuted, children whose deaths were never even officially acknowledged. A video plays continuously featuring Dr. Robert Freeman and descendants of the missing boys sharing family stories about the children who vanished, explaining how these disappearances traumatized entire communities, reflecting on the ongoing impact of racial violence that was ignored and covered up. On opening day, Marcus stands in the gallery as visitors engage with the exhibition. He sees people study the photograph of Bobo the Clown with the two boys, understanding gradually what they're really seeing: not entertainment, but exploitation. Not a charming children's performer, but a predator who targeted the most vulnerable children in a racist society that deemed them disposable. Dr. Robert Freeman stands beside him, looking at his grandfather's written testimony displayed under glass. "My grandfather lived to be 78 years old," Robert says quietly. He carried the trauma of what Bobo did to him, and the guilt of surviving when so many other boys didn't, for his entire life. He testified in 1923, and when no one believed him, he wrote everything down, so at least his family would know the truth. Now, 101 years after he testified, the truth is finally being told publicly. It's too late for justice, but at least there's acknowledgement. A young black mother with her son, perhaps 8 years old, the same age as many of the missing boys, stops in front of the memorial wall, listing the victims' names. She reads each name aloud to her son, explaining that these were children who were taken and hurt and never came home, that their families never stopped looking for them, never stopped grieving. An elderly white woman stops to look at the photograph of Bobo the Clown for a long time. Finally, she approaches Marcus and Helen. "My grandmother lived in Birmingham during this time," she says. "She used to talk about Bobo the Clown performing at her birthday parties. I grew up hearing about him as a beloved entertainer. I never knew—" She stops, composing herself. "I never knew he was doing this to colored children while entertaining white children. That's horrifying." "Yes," Helen says gently, "and that's why this history needs to be told. People need to understand that racial violence took many forms, that predators exploited racism to target black children, and that white communities often remained willfully ignorant of the suffering happening right in front of them." Throughout the day, visitors engage deeply with the exhibition, reading every document, watching the videos multiple times, sitting in the memorial space with the weight of what they're learning. The photograph that seemed to show a clown with young performers reveals itself to be documentation of a crime, evidence of systematic abuse and murder that went unpunished because the victims were black children whose lives didn't matter to white authorities. As the museum prepares to close that evening, Marcus walks through the gallery one more time. He stops in front of the photograph, looking at those two terrified boys whose names are lost to history, who may have been among the victims Isaiah Freeman tried to save through his testimony. He thinks about Walter Hartley, who died respected and unpunished, who spent years abducting, abusing, and murdering black children while performing as a beloved entertainer. Hartley's crimes were protected by the racism that made black children invisible, that ensured their disappearances would never be seriously investigated. He thinks about the 23 boys whose families filed missing persons, reports that police dismissed. He thinks about the children whose remains were found in 1915 and then ignored, buried without names or acknowledgement. He thinks about Isaiah Freeman, who survived and testified and wrote everything down, preserving the truth even when the world refused to hear it. The photograph had waited 116 years to reveal its truth. The image that seemed to document a cheerful entertainer with young performers was actually evidence of a predator displaying his victims, a monster hiding behind makeup and a smile, exploiting racism to commit horrific crimes against the most vulnerable members of society. Now, the photograph has fulfilled a purpose Isaiah Freeman surely hoped for when he testified in 1923. The truth has been revealed, the victims have been named and honored, and the systematic failure of justice has been documented and condemned. As visitors file past the image one last time, seeing it clearly for what it really shows, not entertainment, but predation, not charity, but exploitation, not a beloved community figure, but a child killer who operated with impunity because his victims were black children in a white supremacist society. Marcus thinks about all the other stories hidden in photographs, all the other victims whose truth was suppressed, all the other families who never received justice or even acknowledgement. Isaiah Freeman's testimony has finally been heard. The missing boys of Birmingham have finally been honored, and Marcus is grateful to have played a part in ensuring that this horrific history is no longer hidden, that the truth about what happened behind Bobo the Clown's painted smile is known and remembered, and that the children who died at Walter Hartley's hands are finally acknowledged as the victims of a crime that should never have been allowed to happen, that should have been investigated, that should have resulted in justice, but was instead covered up by a racist system that deemed black children's lives worthless. The horror hidden behind the clown costume has finally been exposed, and the memory of those children, Samuel Johnson, Thomas Williams, David Carter, and all the others whose names are lost, will be preserved and honored for generations to come.